I walked through those doors, my brother dropped his champagne glass. It shattered on the marble floor, and every head in the room turned, not toward the broken glass, but toward me. My mother's hand froze midair, reaching for my father's arm. My father just stared. His face didn't go pale. It went gray, like all the color had been drained out of him at once, like someone had pulled a plug. And my sister-in-law, the one wearing the dress that used to be my design, accepting the award that used to have my name on it. She whispered something to the woman next to her. I was far enough away that I couldn't hear it. But I've spent 8 years imagining what that sentence sounded like. I didn't need to hear it. I knew. She hadn't expected me to come back. None of them had. Let me go back to the beginning, because you need to understand what kind of family I came from before you can understand what they took from me. I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside. My father was a structural engineer with his own firm. My mother organized charity galas and sat on the board of 2 nonprofits. We had a big house in a quiet suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone and nobody talked about anything real. I was the middle child. My older brother, who I'll call my brother, was 4 years ahead of me. My younger sister was 3 years behind, and from the time I was old enough to notice, I understood that I was the one who didn't quite fit. My brother was my father's project, groomed from age 10 to take over the engineering firm one day. My father coached his soccer teams, drove him to SAT prep, took him to job sites on weekends. My sister was my mother's, soft-spoken, pretty, obedient in the specific way my mother valued. She wore what my mother picked out for her. She laughed at my mother's jokes. She never pushed back. I pushed back. Not because I was trying to cause trouble. I pushed back because I was curious. I asked why. I disagreed at dinner. I had opinions about things my mother found embarrassing for a girl my age to have opinions about. I wanted to study fashion design, and in my family, that was practically a joke. My mother used to say it to her friends when she thought I wasn't in earshot. She thinks she's going to design clothes. The way she said it, the little exhale before she moved on to something more interesting. I heard that exhale in my dreams for years. I applied to Parsons. I got in. My father looked at the acceptance letter, set it on the kitchen counter, and said, "We're not paying for that." I was 18. I didn't have a backup plan. What followed was the worst year of my life, up to that point anyway. I deferred my enrollment, worked 2 jobs, applied for every scholarship I could find. I barely slept. I ate cereal for most of my meals because it was cheap. My mother told people I was taking a gap year to figure myself out, which was her way of making my survival look like laziness. I did eventually get to Parsons. Partial scholarship, student loans for the rest, a room in an apartment with 3 other girls where we kept our groceries in labeled bags in the fridge. I was 20 when I finally walked through those doors, and I cried in the bathroom on the first day because I couldn't believe I'd actually made it. I thrived there. That's not arrogance, I say it because it still surprises me even now. I'd spent so many years being the one who didn't fit that I hadn't fully believed I was good at anything. But design came to me like breathing. My professors noticed. I started winning student competitions. By my junior year, I had a portfolio that people asked to look at. I called home occasionally, mostly out of obligation. My mother would update me on my brother's career, my sister's social life, neighborhood gossip. She rarely asked about my work. When I told her I'd won a regional design competition, she said, "That's nice, honey. Your brother just got promoted." I stopped calling as often after that. I graduated at 22 and got a junior position at a mid-sized design house in New York. Small salary, long hours, the kind of job where you carried coffee and did sample runs, but also, occasionally, got to sit in on real conversations with real designers making real decisions. I was hungry for all of it. During that time, I met a woman, a senior designer who took an interest in my work. She was honest and exacting, and she did not give compliments casually, which made every rare compliment feel like something worth keeping. Under her mentorship, I developed what would become my signature, structural garments with unexpected softness, clean lines that moved, clothes that looked disciplined from across the room and felt intimate up close. I had a sketchbook I kept with me always. I filled it with ideas, silhouettes, fabric textures, construction notes in the margins. I was building something, even then, though I didn't have a name for it yet. Here's what I didn't know was happening back in Ohio. My sister-in-law, my brother had married her 2 years after my departure, had always wanted to work in fashion. She'd mentioned it a few times at family dinners before I left. In the vague way people mention dreams they don't seriously pursue. She had a marketing degree and worked in local advertising. There was nothing wrong with that. There was nothing wrong with her wanting more than that either. What was wrong was what she decided to do about it. I only found out much later, pieced together from documents and from a conversation with my grandmother that I'll get to. But she had gone to my mother sometime in the year after I left for New York and asked to see my old sketchbooks, the ones I'd left in my childhood bedroom, the ones I hadn't taken with me because I thought they were safe. My mother gave them to her. I don't know if my mother understood exactly what that would lead to. I've spent years trying to decide whether she was naive or complicit, and I've come to believe it was both. That she didn't think it through, but also didn't particularly care. Because the daughter whose sketchbooks they were had left, and the daughter-in-law who wanted them was here, and here mattered more than gone. My sister-in-law used those early sketches as the foundation for a portfolio. She enrolled in a short-term design program, used the portfolio to apply for positions, and within a couple of years, had built herself a professional identity in Columbus's small but growing design community. Some of the silhouettes she showed were recognizably mine. The proportion work, the specific way I handled collars and sleeve caps, which my Parsons professor had told me was unusually distinctive. She built a career on the foundation of my early work, and my family, every single one of them, let it happen. I didn't know any of this while it was happening. I was in New York, working 80-hour weeks, slowly building my own reputation. I had cut off most contact with my family by then, not dramatically, not with a scene, just the gradual fading that happens when you stop being able to pretend that the distance doesn't exist. We texted on birthdays. I sent a card at Christmas. That was the extent of it. What broke through the silence was my grandmother. My grandmother on my father's side was a woman who had lived through enough to have no patience for pretense. She was sharp and funny, and she had always been the one person in my family who talked to me like I was worth talking to. She called me every few weeks even after I went quiet with everyone else. She asked about my work. She wanted to see photographs of things I'd made. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and she didn't say hello first. She said, "I need you to come home. I need to tell you something in person, and I'm not going to do it on the phone." I flew back to Ohio that weekend. She sat me down in her kitchen, the one that smelled like coffee and the particular hand lotion she'd used my entire life, and she told me about the sketchbooks. She told me what she'd seen at a local design showcase the previous spring, my sister-in-law presenting work that my grandmother, who had watched me draw since I was a child, recognized immediately. The proportions, the handwriting in the margins of the displayed sketches. She said she'd stood in front of one of the framed pieces for a long time and felt something cold move through her. I didn't say anything at the time she told me. I didn't know what to say. I went home and I sat with it and I thought about it for months, and then I realized that sitting with it and not telling you was the same as being part of it. I sat in her kitchen and I didn't speak for a long time. She also told me something else, something I had not known. My grandfather, who had died 3 years earlier, had left something for me in his will. Not the bulk of the estate that went to my father and my uncle according to the primary terms, but a specific bequest. A sum of money, meaningful but not enormous, and a letter. The bequest had been intended to help me pursue the work she was born to do, according to the language my grandfather had apparently used when he drafted the will. I had never received it. I had never been told it existed. My grandmother had assumed I'd received it and chosen not to mention it. It wasn't until she'd started pulling on the thread of the sketchbook situation that she'd spoken to the estate attorney and discovered that the bequest had been distributed. But not to me. The paperwork listed my name, but the account it had been transferred into was not mine. Someone had forged my signature on the transfer documentation. Someone had stolen my inheritance. I sat in my grandmother's kitchen, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not grief exactly. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter. A kind of terrible clarity. I had not imagined it. All those years of feeling like I was on the outside of my own family, of feeling unseen, dismissed, replaced. It had not been in my head. It had been real. They had looked at what I built, at what I was building, and they had decided it was available for the taking. I hired an attorney before I flew back to New York. She specialized in estate disputes and intellectual property. I brought her everything, my original sketchbooks from before I left. I had taken some with me after all. The ones from my earliest years had stayed behind, but I had notebooks from Parsons that established the continuity of my work, the evolution of techniques that were distinctly mine, the documentation my grandmother had gathered from the estate attorney, photographs I found online of my sister-in-law's showcased work compared with photographs of my own early pieces. It took 8 months. I want to be honest about that because I think people imagine justice happens quickly and it doesn't. It is slow and expensive, and there are days when you sit across from your attorney in a conference room and you feel nothing but exhaustion. There are days when you think about dropping it, not because you were wrong, but because continuing feels like choosing to stay inside the pain. I kept going because my grandmother asked me to, and because I owed it to the girl who ate cereal for dinner and worked 2 jobs and cried in a Parsons bathroom because she couldn't believe she'd made it. She deserved to have the record set straight. The estate matter was resolved first. The forensic document examiner confirmed the signature on the transfer paperwork was forged. The funds, plus interest, per the estate attorney's calculations, were returned to me. My father called during this process, once to say that things had gotten confused and that there had been a miscommunication. He did not apologize, he did not explain. I said I would have my attorney contact his. The intellectual property matter was more complicated and ultimately settled out of court. I won't detail the terms. What I will say is that my sister-in-law was required to remove certain pieces from her professional portfolio and could no longer represent them as her original work. She was not criminally charged. Civil settlement was the path my attorney recommended, and she was right that it was cleaner and faster. But there was a paper trail now, a legal finding, something that existed in the world that said this work was not hers. I had not been back to Columbus in 8 years when I found out about the design award. It was a regional competition, not national, not the kind of thing that makes news outside Ohio, but it was significant in the local design community, the kind of thing that, had I stayed and worked locally, I might have pursued. My sister-in-law had entered. She'd been nominated based on a body of work that the settlement had already established was partially derivative of mine. I found out about the ceremony through a former classmate who still lived in Columbus and had seen my name connected to the legal proceedings. "You should come," she texted me. "Everyone who matters knows what happened. It would mean something." I booked a flight. I didn't call ahead. I didn't tell my family. I put on the dress I'd designed for my own last show, structured shoulders, deep burgundy, the kind of garment that enters a room a half second before you do. And I walked into that event space like I belonged there, because I did. Because I had always belonged in rooms like that. I just spent years being told otherwise. That's when my brother dropped his glass. I watched my mother's face go through about 6 different expressions in 3 seconds before it settled into something careful and controlled. My father looked at me the way people look at something they were hoping had gone away. My sister-in-law, up near the front of the room, had gone very still. I did not make a scene. That had never been the plan. I found my grandmother, who had known I was coming and was sitting near the back with a look on her face like she'd been waiting for this moment for 8 years, and I sat down beside her and I took her hand. The evening proceeded. My sister-in-law did not win. The award went to a designer I didn't know, a young woman from Dayton whose work was bold and entirely her own. When they read the winner's name, I heard my sister-in-law exhale from across the room. My father approached me during the reception. I had expected anger, or at least the cold formality he defaulted to when he felt it cornered. What I got was something I hadn't prepared for. He looked old, tired, like the story he'd been telling himself for years had gotten too heavy to carry, and he was finally, in that moment, feeling the weight of it. He said, "You didn't have to do this." I said, "I know, I wanted to." He didn't say anything else. He walked back toward my mother, and I watched him go, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not vindication, Something more complicated and more final. Something that felt like the closing of a door. Not a slam, just a quiet, deliberate click. My grandmother cried a little on the way out, the good kind of crying, the kind that comes from relief. She held my face in both her hands and said, "You always deserved better than what they gave you." I said, "I know that now." Because that's the part nobody tells you about when you're in the middle of it. When you're eating cereal for dinner and working two jobs and trying to believe you're worth something despite every signal telling you otherwise. Nobody tells you that one day you'll stand in a room that was supposed to exclude you, wearing a dress you made yourself, next to the only person in your family who ever chose you, and you'll feel not triumphant exactly, but whole. Like the version of yourself you were always becoming has finally caught up to the version of yourself you had to pretend to be for everyone else's comfort. I flew back to New York the next morning. I had a collection deadline in 2 weeks and a fitting scheduled for Monday and a life I had built entirely with my own hands. I didn't look back at the terminal. I didn't need to. Some doors you close gently, not because what happened behind them didn't matter, but because you finally stopped needing to reopen them. There's a particular kind of grief that nobody prepares you for. The grief of realizing your family was never going to choose you, and that you spent years waiting for something that was never coming. I felt that grief in my grandmother's kitchen, sitting across from her while she told me what she'd seen at that showcase. The smell of her hand lotion, the coffee going cold between us, the weight of what she was saying settling into my chest like something permanent. But here's what I've come to understand, looking back at everything, at the cereal dinners and the two jobs and the bathroom at Parsons and the attorney's conference room and that burgundy dress walking through those doors, what happened to me was not random. Every choice has a consequence, and the consequences in my story landed exactly where they were supposed to. My sister-in-law built her early career on work that wasn't hers. That's not just a legal matter, it's a fundamental question of character. When you take credit for someone else's thinking, someone else's late nights, someone else's hunger, you are making a statement about who you are. You are saying that your comfort matters more than someone else's truth, and that statement, eventually, catches up with you. Not because the universe is keeping score in any mystical sense, but because work that isn't rooted in genuine ability cannot grow the way real work grows. The foundation was borrowed. The cracks were always going to show. What carried me through, and I want to be honest about this because it wasn't noble or easy, was a combination of things I didn't have names for at the time. The first was something like integrity, the stubborn insistence on building something that was actually mine, even when nobody was watching and nobody would have known the difference if I'd cut corners. The second was clarity of mind, learning to read situations accurately instead of how I wished they were, understanding what the attorney needed, understanding what the attorney needed, understanding what the documents proved, understanding when to push and when to wait. The third was simply not stopping. Not because I was fearless, but because I was more afraid of looking back at my life and seeing a person who quit than I was of the difficulty in front of me. My grandmother had that third quality in abundance. She sat on what she knew for months because she wasn't sure what to do with it, but when she decided that silence was its own kind of complicity, she picked up the phone. She didn't have to do that. She was old and tired, and it would have been easier not to. She did it anyway. That, to me, is what it looks like to live with integrity at 70-something years old. To choose the harder right thing even when the easier wrong thing is right there. I think about the version of me who almost didn't pursue it, who sat in that kitchen and felt the exhaustion of it and thought about letting it go, moving on, not reopening any of it. That version of me is understandable. She was tired, but she would have carried something unresolved for the rest of her life, not just about the sketchbooks or the inheritance, but about herself, about whether she was worth fighting for. I flew back to New York the morning after the ceremony. I had a collection deadline. I had a life. And I had finally, at 31 years old, stopped needing anyone in that family to tell me those things were real.